This is our final event, public event, in our weekend of the first Platypus International Convention. So thank you all for coming out this afternoon. Today's panel is entitled The Platypus Synthesis, History, Theory, and Practice. And our presenters will be Richard, Rubin, Cutrone, and Ian Morrison. And each of them will cover different aspects of these three elements of what we are calling the platypus synthesis. The basic thrust of today's conversation is to provide an explanation for the reason for platypus, the existence of platypus, through these three different interrelated elements of the project. So I'm not going to give any real introductory remarks. I'm just going to go right into the presenters' comments, and then I'll moderate a question and answer period afterwards. So we'll begin with Richard.
Okay. The title of my talk is Four Types of Ambiguity, and it's of course a takeoff on William Empson's classic 1930 book, Seven Types of Ambiguity, which is heralded with launching the new criticism. The thesis of it is that platypus as a project can best be understood by considering the plausible misreadings of platypus and how platypus both is and is not like the ways it might be misunderstood. Hence the emphasis on our ambiguity. But perhaps that is exactly what one would expect from a project named after an egg-laying mammal that looks like a cross between a duck and a beaver. The notion of ambiguity is itself ambiguous, however. To quote Empson, quoting him, an ambiguity in ordinary speech means something pronounced and as a rule witty or deceitful. I propose to use the word in an extended sense, and I shall think relevant to my subject any verbal nuance, however slight, which gives room to alternative reactions to the same piece of language. Sometimes the word may be stretched absurdly far, but it is descriptive because it suggests the analytical method, and with that I am concerned. At the end of this talk, I hope that you feel that I have been witty, and you may very well feel that I have been deceitful. And, like Empson, I will at times stretch the word ambiguity absurdly far. Unlike him, however, I will be concerned with ambiguities of thought and ideology rather than language. I will consider four types of ambiguity relating to platypus, or should I say, four questions. The first three types of ambiguity are rather straightforward and involve political misreadings. The fourth, however, is more complicated and involves epistemological problems. The first three involve accusations and come from without. The fourth, however, is a problem coming from within. It involves not how outsiders are likely to misunderstand the project, but rather how we ourselves are likely to misunderstand the problems we pose. We will leave consideration of it for last. The three political accusations that we will consider are that we are Spartacists, that we are neoconservatives, and that we are liberals. Like classical anti-Semitic theories about Jews that combine contradictory notions of Jews as plutocrats and Jews as communists, the hostility to and anxiety generated by platypus sometimes seems to take in contradictory notions. So that some of our critics seem to feel that we are some sort of monstrous Spartacist neocon liberals all at once. Excuse me.
Bring the mic a little closer.
Just bring the mic forward. I am reminded by this of the hippogriff, a mythological creature, part eagle, part horse, and part snake. Picture of a hippogriff here, by the way. As you can see, it is nowhere near as cuddly as a platypus. They're sometimes, I'm told, mistaken for griffins, but they're different. They have the same diet as griffins, whatever that is. Anyway, the creator of this political monster is supposedly a nefarious character named Chris Cutrone, a charismatic teacher and corrupter of impressionable youth. Before I begin an examination of the intellectual content of Platypus, some remarks about the personal and pedagogical aspects of the project are in order. As someone who knew Chris before he brainwashed himself into becoming a Cutronist, I have a somewhat different take on the issue of Cutronism. Unlike many of you for whom the ideas of platypus, indeed the existence of platypus, came as a unified package, I came to them at the same time Chris did, not as a student of his, but simply as someone following a common ideological trajectory. Because Chris's pedagogy has been so central to the development of Platypus, my long non-pedagogical relationship to Chris perhaps gives me a better perspective to discuss Platypus from than those who have been in Platypus because of pedagogical relationship. While Chris has been central to the development of Platypus, and Platypus would certainly not exist without him, he is not the sole source of its ideas, even though this may seem to be the case because he has been our main spokesman. Does Platypus then have an ideology? Where did it come from? The answer to these questions cannot be as straightforward as one would hope. I will use phrases like we and platypus, but these are meant to suggest an idealized collective consciousness, not the decisions of a specific body or even particular individuals. It represents what I estimate is the basic common understanding of those members of Platypus who have the best understanding of the intellectual foundations of the project. It is certainly not, as I have indicated, an exegesis of Chris Cutrone's thought. I, for one, have significant disagreements with many of Chris's formulations. On the other hand, what I will say is not a democratically agreed upon program either. As a political organization, Platypus seeks to be run by a democratically elected leadership. But as an ideological enterprise, the pedagogical model predominates. This is a somewhat contradictory and undesirable state of affairs, but it is also at present a necessary one, even if it gives rise to the notion of Platypus as a Cutronist cult. Platypus is not a political party and does not have a line. Yet it clearly stakes out certain ideological positions. Explaining the tension between these two statements can become as complicated as explaining the wave-particle duality. Precision in certain areas is achieved at the expense of precision in others. Platypus is still a work in progress. The questions it seeks to pose are extremely difficult ones that have no easy answers. Some of them may be unanswerable, and Platypus as a project may be a delusion. But we do not want to pretend that Platypus is merely an open-ended search for truth, either. Platypus embodies a distinct sensibility and set of ideas that make it unique on the left, or rather among the ruins of the historic left. Like our namesake, the platypus, we are a peculiar creature, but a real one. Here I will now try to explore our peculiarities in an also somewhat peculiar way. Instead of merely rejecting the accusations, I will try rather to seek a limited truth in each of them, and show that in each case a fragment has been mistaken for the totality. We will look at each part of the hippogriff in turn and ask what it says about us that we are understood this way. The first accusation we will consider is that Platypus is a form of spartacism and that we are crypto-spartacists. As most of you here will know, the relationship of Platypus to the actual Spartacist League is quite asymmetrical. And the Spartacist League has nothing but vitriolic contempt for us. To them, we are pro-imperialist, talk shop, postmodern claptrap, etc. Certainly, the actual Spartacists do not see us as in any way similar to them. We, though, have considerable respect for the Spartacist League, or at least their historic role. We encourage people to read many of their pamphlets, for example, and treat them as qualitatively different from other sectarian left groups. How is this asymmetry to be understood? There's a certain type of glass that on one side looks like an ordinary mirror, but on the other side is like looking through a transparent but dark-colored window, rather like a gigantic set of sunglasses. It is often used in nursery schools so that parents can come and observe their children playing and interacting with other children, but the children do not know that they are being observed. The Spartacists are on the mirror side of the glass, and they cannot see us, because they can only see reflections of themselves, and we can only be understood as a distorted reflection. People who, as they put it, quote, use our texts to eviscerate them of revolutionary content, unquote. We, on the other hand, can see the Spartacists as through a glass darkly. If one mentions the Sparts to most leftists, the response is likely to be that they are crazy or ultra-leftist sectarians. In fact, the Sparts are only crazy and sectarian in a secondary sense. That is, that they have been driven into a posture which necessarily seems crazy and sectarian. And the need to maintain that position does ultimately end up making them crazy and sectarian in reality. But they are certainly not ultra-leftist, and that they are perceived as such by nearly everyone on the left is a sign of how far to the right most of the left, quote unquote, has gone. The tragedy of the Spartacists is that they're hated not for their actual pathologies, but rather for their non-pathological aspects. It is not their shrillness that is the real reason they are despised, but rather their genuine insights into the nature of political reality. The Sparts understand correctly that the vast majority of the so-called left is really a fake left, and that this is in fact the fundamental reason why the world is such a miserable place. What the Spartacist League does not account for, however, is why millions and tens of millions of people do not share their views. Rather, like the Red Queen in Alice Through the Looking Glass, the Sparts run as fast as they can, but only to stay in the same place. This is our fundamental difference with them, our emphasis on historical regression. Although they inevitably assume our differences are based on some set of political differences, some position, for example, the Iraq War, our actual differences are meta-historical and involve the nature of Marxism. One might even say the nature of history. It is impossible to express these in the language available to the Spartacists. A mathematical analogy may be useful. The Riemannian notion of curved space cannot be expressed in the language of Euclidean geometry. Things can be curved in space, of course, but space itself cannot be curved. I mean, Gabe is smiling. It's really talking about manifolds. But curved space to a Euclidean geometer is simply gibberish. On the other hand, from a Riemannian standpoint, Euclidean geometry is easy to understand. It's simply the special case where the curvature of space is everywhere zero. However, accepting the logical coherence of non-Euclidean geometries still leaves open the question of whether or not they are true. For many decades after non-Euclidean geometries had been accepted by mathematicians, it remained an open question as whether or not real physical space was Euclidean or not. Eventually, it was determined by physicists in the 20th century that it is not Euclidean, but that is an empirical fact. Kant was wrong to believe that on a priori grounds, space must necessarily be Euclidean. But equally clearly, there is no logical reason for space not to be Euclidean, as it seems to be for thousands of years. Similarly, although to the Sparts a platypus position is necessarily gibberish, the opposite is not the case. And from our meta-historical standpoint, one could raise the question seriously of whether, after all, the Sparts might not be right. I obviously do not think that is so, since if I did, I would not be here. But that is no reason to rejoice. Indeed, if the Spartacists were right and Platypus were wrong, that would be reason to rejoice, since ours is undoubtedly a darker view than theirs. However, perhaps that last sentence is not quite right. Ours is a darker view than the Sparts to the extent that we believe what we say and that they believe what they say. But often the Sparts remind me of soldiers bravely doing their duty, willing to fight to the death even though they know the war is lost. The willingness to express pessimism is not necessarily the best measure of it. Only at their heights could the Greeks write great tragedies. In their decadence, they could at best produce the pleasant farces of the new comedy. There's an essay by George Steiner in which he compares Trotsky to a tragic hero. Perhaps a large part of the problem with contemporary Trotskyism is that it lacks a tragic character. If Platypus is not a form of Spartacism, then perhaps we are a form of neoconservatism. Just as no actual Spartacist is going to see us as bearing a resemblance to Spartacism, no actual neoconservative is going to mistake us for neoconservatives or the Platypus Review for the Weekly Standard. But the impulse to see us as neocons is highly symptomatic. Like the hatred of the Sparts, the hysteria about the neocons reveals a great deal about the bad faith of the left. The sense that we are neoconservatives is not really the sense that we're like Irving Kristol or Paul Wolfowitz, but rather that we are like Christopher Hitchens. The anger directed at the Hitchens is the anger directed at an ex-leftist who insists that it was the left that betrayed him rather than he the left. Just as the Stalinophobia of the late Shachtman, causing him to support Nixon, was at least subjectively a distorted extension of his earlier Trotskyist anti-Stalinism. Similarly, the impulse that pushes the Hitchens towards supporting U.S. imperialism is revulsion at leftist support for Islamist reactionaries. The notion that the neocons or Trotskyists who have pinned their face on U.S. imperialism instead of world revolution is, of course, ridiculous, but it contains a germ of truth. It needs, however, to be stood on its head. It is the failure of Trotskyism in the 20th century, that is revolutionary Marxism, that has made neoconservatism possible. The neoconservatives are a distorted reflection of the left, just as classical conservatism is a response to the rise of the left. It was the French Revolution that made possible Edmund Burke, but it was the 1960s that paved the way for neoconservatism. If the hatred directed at the Spartacists is because they remind the left of its abandonment of revolutionary Marxism, the hysteria about the neocons is because they remind the left that all political change in the world now happens from the right. What is most striking about the wars in Iraq and Afghanistan is that the military might of U.S. imperialism is not aimed at leftist insurgents as it would have been in the past, but rather Islamist reactionaries. Merely saying this makes many on the left very uncomfortable, though. So to us, the apostasy of the Hitchens is really a less clear, less provocative, and, let us say it, less hopeful version of Platypus declaring the left is dead. What is interesting to Platypus about the neocons is not their ideas. After all, supporting U.S. imperialism is hardly a strikingly original idea. Rather, it is what they illuminate in a negative sense. It is insofar as neoconservatism represents an unconscious alienation from the conservatism and cynicism of the so-called left that we are interested in it. It is insofar, though, as the response to this alienation is simply an open embrace of the right, it is uninteresting. We do not need to support the neocons, whose policies, of course, are being continued by Obama just as effectively, or U.S. imperialism, because they and it need the support of Platypus as little as the North Korean deformed worker state needs the Spartacist League to defend it. For us, the problem of neoconservatism is fundamentally about understanding the left, or in the case of the neocons, the ex-left, as a collection of symptoms. Etymologically, the word symptom is related to the word asymptotic. One might say that Platypus is the study of asymptotic symptoms of the left, the recognition of a meeting point ad infinity of symptoms of an historical condition that is poorly represented by the categories of left and right. Finally, we come to the third part of the political hippogriff. Perhaps we in Platypus are simply liberals in the end. Certainly, for the most part, we are primarily talking to them. It is unlikely we can win over people from, say, the Spartacist League, and it's unlikely, equally unlikely, we could win over neoconservatives, whatever hidden affinities we may have with either or both. Instead, we talk to a mostly soft, left liberal, rad-lib, anarchoid milieu. Most of these people do not like being called liberals. Anarchists think of themselves as revolutionary, as more radical than conservative Marxists. To such people, we say that anarchism nowadays is just a dishonest liberalism, a liberalism in denial about its own liberalism. Indeed, we prefer the honest liberals, the open Obama supporters, to the anarchists and ISO supporters, etc. Ideally for Platypus, this is our fantasy, although it will of course never happen, all the anarchists, anarchoids, ISOers, RCPers, paraconmen, etc. would suddenly vanish in the rapture. And only Obama supporters, the Sparts and us, would be left behind. In such a context, Platypus would have the least noise to compete with. So, in SDS, an organization in which several Platypus members participated, the role of Platypus was essentially to try to push SDS into a recognition of its own incoherent liberalism. The goal was not to push SDS to the left, but rather into self-recognition of its own incoherent politics. To imagine one could push SDS to the left would have been to give too much credit to the incoherent liberalism that motivated it. This attitude by Platypus naturally can make us seem to the right of SDS. So there's a recent critique of Platypus participation in the Naomi Klein Friedman Institute debate in WV that said that Platypus does not even want the crumbs that they do. meaning that Platypus is to the right of even wretched reformists like Klein and the SDS. That's the Spartan. But this preference for honest liberalism over the manifold dishonest varieties contains yet another danger. Thus, while Platypus certainly wanted and expected Obama to win, it did so for the peculiar reason that it saw an Obama victory as disorienting to what we call the bad left, and thus politically clarifying. But if Obama's victory was indeed disorienting to what we call the bad left, it was equally disorienting to us, since there was the ever-present temptation to read Obamaism in a traditional progressivist way rather than as further regress. The problem posed by liberalism is that what constitutes revolutionary politics in the present is not clear. On the one hand, a group like the ISO simply dresses up rad-lib movementism as revolutionary politics. And on the other, the Sparts simply understand revolutionary politics as the maintenance of correct positions. For us, however, it is not clear that there is any possibility of revolutionary politics at all in the present. Thus, we are in the paradoxical position of both defending the necessity of revolutionary politics while simultaneously bracketing the possibility of revolutionary politics. Clearly, a very thin line separates intellectual honesty from self-delusion here. Precisely because the default political background against which we operate is an academic liberalism, our bracketing the possibility of revolutionary politics, despite our insistence on the need for them as the lodestar of our ideological orientation, nevertheless leaves open constantly the possibility of our simply becoming a smarter version of academic liberalism, despite the high levels of anxiety generated by our willingness to entertain Spartacist, quote-unquote, or neoconservative, quote-unquote, positions. The real ideological danger is, in fact, that we will simply become a smart, slightly eccentric version of academic liberalism, a more serious version of Slavoj Žižek, perhaps. The collegiality of the academic environment we predominantly operate in also acts as an inhibiting force. Fundamentally, academic leftism, and by default, we are a variety of academic leftism at this point, is deeply apolitical. The complement of our ambivalent relationship to Spartacism is our relationship to the work of Moïse Postone. As much as the Platypus synthesis can be described as an attempt to synthesize Trotsky and Adorno, it can also be described as an attempt to unite what is of value in the superficially, wildly divergent insights of the Spartacist League and Moïse Postone. To do this, particularly since both the Sparts and Postone are still alive, unlike Trotsky and Adorno, we must, of course, maintain the conceit that we understand both the Sparts and Postone better than they do themselves. This poses two questions. The first is whether the Platypus thesis that both Postone and the Sparts can be understood as wildly divergent symptoms of a common crisis on the left is, in fact, as the most interesting symptoms, as opposed to the myriad uninteresting symptoms, is in fact correct. Most people outside of this room, including both Postone and the Sparts, would dismiss this idea as either hogwash or lunacy. The second question is internal to Platypus and concerns the relative weight of these two elements. There are two ways that Platypus members tend to think of the Platypus project ideologically. One group tends to think of it as left Postonism, and the other as neo-Trotskyism. And there is considerable tension between these two views. So it is not only a question of whether one accepts the possibility, dubious to most people, of the synthesis, but also the relative weight one assigns to the components. Of course, this attempt to marry Postone and Spartacism may remind some people of the anecdote about George Bernard Shaw. When a famous beauty suggested they marry, saying, "With my beauty and your brains, think what wonderful children we would have," Shaw replied, "Yes, but what if they had my beauty and your brains?" Lastly, I will raise the epistemological problem. I will state it in its strongest form. Is it possible that we in Platypus will be the greatest misunderstanders of Platypus? Is it possible that we in Platypus cannot understand Platypus? That Platypus is in essence a project based on a deep misunderstanding of itself? Yes, it is possible. If we see in the present degenerate state of leftist politics a collection of symptoms, we must add that we too are an acute symptom. If the left is a corpse, we too are part of the stench. We must, though, like Alyosha Karamazov, faced with the stench of the rotting Holy Father Zosima, not surrender to our initial impulse of despair with this realization. Thinking through this limitation of our ability to understand Platypus may paradoxically be the best way of understanding Platypus. The ideological core of our project is based on recognition of past defeats and their cumulative effects, and as such, we are in constant danger of embracing the necessity of defeat even as we formally deny it. This is a fairly obvious danger. But the deeper problem is what, for lack of a better term, must be called the opacity of the present. With each passing generation, the Marxist project becomes more tenuous. Its language becomes more esoteric. It becomes both more elusive and elusive, more akin to religious mysticism than scientific materialism. It is not merely bourgeois ideology that obscures social reality, as for our high Marxist predecessors. Rather, the nature of social reality itself seems to become increasingly opaque, and the decline of Marxism is accompanied by the simultaneous disintegration of bourgeois culture, the ground out of which Marxism emerged as an imminent critique. Postmodernism is the reactionary manifestation of this, the celebration of as emancipatory of an incoherence that is the product of contingent historical defeats. Against postmodernism, we are hypermodernists. It is not modernism that failed, but rather our condition is the expression of the inability, ultimately political, to complete modernity by abolishing capitalism. Platypus is clearly marked by its moment. Mostly Platypus is a group of quite young people. The oldest contingent in Platypus consists of those of us who were in college in 1989. The youngest of people who were born or in utero then. None of us directly experienced the politics of the 1960s. We are a product of late Bushism and early Obamaism. Culturally, we share in the general exhaustion with baby boomerism and the endless recycling of the 1960s, a decade towards which we have a rather jaundiced and certainly not nostalgic attitude. The youth of Platypus also enables it to historicize the 20th century. This has many advantages since it enables one to sidestep many problems. Nowadays, historians of the 16th and 17th century do not feel compelled to take a side in the religious wars between Protestants and Catholics. A modern historian would not generally be interested, as was still the case for many in the 19th century, whether, say, Wallenstein or Richelieu should be praised or condemned for their actions, but rather would want to understand the context in which those actions occurred. In a similar way, the struggle between Cannon and Shachtman in 1939 and 40 has achieved a certain distance for Platypus that would certainly not for a group like the Spartacists did. We do not study the history of the left then to know where we would have been on the barricades, but rather to find the ruptures and subterranean linkages in a problematic history. But while this attitude has advantages, it poses certain problems too. I've been speaking so far of the resistance to Platypus, the anxiety generated by the project. But what of the opposite? Often I have found myself wondering at the ease with which Platypus was being accepted. It seemed to be going down too easily with many people. I am made uncomfortable often by the absence of resistance to Platypus, just as I am constantly frustrated by the manifest resistance to the project. I have often suspected that if the Platypus notion of the death of the left were to become widespread, it would signal the failure of Platypus, not its success, since it would mean only that the notion that the left is dead had lost its provocative quality and thus become naturalized as fact. Trying to understand this paradox, I've been led to a curious and somewhat provocative analogy. Radical political theory in our time reminds me of pornography. If Marcuse in the 1960s offered the notion of repressive tolerance, we might offer, by contrast, a notion of repressive transgression. Radical political thought nowadays is constantly stressing its naughtiness. But such naughtiness, like pornography, only ends up reinforcing what it supposedly resists. It would clearly be a mistake to imagine that societies that tolerate, produce, and consume pornography are more sexually liberated than societies that try to repress it. On the contrary, the impulse to produce and consume pornography and to repress it are aspects of the same problem. Pornography and Puritanism are twins, not opposites. Pornography is ultimately only about sex in the same way music is about sound. Sex is merely the medium through which a condition of unfreedom is mirrored. As such, pornography is inherently a right-wing phenomenon. Can one imagine pornography trying to express revolutionary sentiments? Only as parody. By contrast, pornography created deliberately as fascist propaganda is extremely easy to imagine. Yet pornography is also ambiguous. One might say that it is a frozen utopian longing and the denial of that longing simultaneously. And just as sadomasochistic role-playing is not equivalent to the desire to be an actual master or an actual slave, so one should not expect that a fantasy of unlimited freedom is a genuine desire for it. About a month ago, on a wall in Neve Tzedek, a hipster neighborhood in South Tel Aviv, it's sort of like Wicker Park, but in Hebrew and closer to the beach, I read a graffito that said, "If you are bored, you are already resisting the system." The image that came to mind was of someone watching a porn movie and being utterly, unbearably bored by it, but unable for some reason to turn it off and do something else. Perhaps this person would continue to hope that the movie would become titillating. Perhaps a nostalgia for a time when pornography was still arousing would continue to sustain viewing. Or perhaps the excruciating boredom would simply be accepted masochistically as suitable punishment for the guilt of craving pornography in the first place. Or perhaps viewing it would be sustained by the thought that everything else was equally boring and obscene, and the whole world is just bad pornography anyway. Like pornography, the left is most honest when it is bored by itself. Unlike pornography, psychoanalysis offers a scarier version of freedom. We in Platypus have taken on a role of psychoanalysis of the left. We seek to dig up and understand repressed memories in order to overcome their debilitating effect. Platypus is, like psychoanalysis, a talking cure. We are, as we are accused of being, a talk shop. Such an approach runs the risk of seeming and perhaps becoming nothing but talk. Certainly, it seems at odds with the heroic traditions of the classical left we admire, which sought to radically transform the world rather than just talk about it. So is Platypus then a reversion to those philosophers who thought merely to interpret the world? No. Capitalism is unique in human history as the only social system to produce the left. For us, both the future of humanity and the key to understanding its past lie in the now uncertain fate of this small fragment of capitalist modernity. Like our predecessors on the classical left, we see no future for humanity in a decaying capitalism. Unlike them, we see our main immediate task as a critique of the left. Our response is historically contingent. If we were living in 1909 instead of 2009, this would not have been our diagnosis. As I have indicated, such an approach is fraught with ambiguity, and as I have shown, the more one examines these ambiguities, the more complicated their ambiguity becomes. Our Marxism is a bridge between highly orthodox and intensely revisionist readings, and we are suspended above a deep fog-shrouded abyss whose bottom we cannot see. But probably the deepest and most perplexing of all our ambiguities, both to ourselves and others, is that although Platypus is itself a response to generations of defeats and is such suffused with despair, it is also a project based on profound hopefulness. Thank you.
Thank you, Richard. Chris will be next.
Okay. I want to begin straight away with something that Richard has raised, on which I'd like to try to elaborate, by way of properly motivating the more positive aspect of Platypus's theory. Not how we are misrecognized as either neoconservatives, crypto-spartacists, or academic left liberals, and what this says negatively about our project, as if in a photographic negative, as Richard has discussed, but rather how we positively think about the intellectual content of our own project. Let me begin with a thought experiment. What if the Spartacist critique of the 1960s New Left and Moïse Postone's critique of the New Left, as disparate and antithetical as they might appear, were both correct? In other words, what if, paradoxically, the problem of the 1960s New Left was that it was simultaneously too traditional and not traditional enough in its Marxism? What if the Spartacists were right, that Stalinism and Trotskyism, and Bolshevism more generally, were not to be conflated, as they were in both Stalinophilic New Leftism of Maoism and Che Guevarism, and Stalinophobic neo-anarchism, situationism, etc.? And what if Postone was correct, that Trotskyism, as part of traditional Marxism, was unable to deal with the problem of mid-20th century capitalism's differences from earlier forms, and not able to address why revolutionary proletarian class consciousness, as it had previously manifested, did not continue, but seemed to become either irrelevant or worse, affirmative of the status quo of the administered society of organized capitalism in the mid-20th century. What both the Spartacists and Postone are unable to address, however, is why neither of their perspectives, which purported to grasp the problem of capital more deeply and in broader historical context than others in the post-1960s left, found virtually no adherents. If we in Platypus say that both the Spartacists and Postone are correct, but both fail to adequately account for their own forms of consciousness, this raises an interesting paradox that points back to issues of historical interpretation for the Spartacists and Postone's points of departure, namely Bolshevism as revolutionary Marxism and Marx's own Marxism. We could say that the problem of the Spartacists and Postone point to two different aspects of temporality in the history of the left. That the Spartacists act as if no historical time intervenes between themselves and 1917, and Postone acts as if the progress of historical transformation leaves the Marxist tradition permanently superseded. Both the Spartacists and Postone acknowledge, in however a limited fashion, the problem of regression. In the case of the Spartacists, the regression is post-1917, and for Postone it is post-1968. But both consider regression in only a linear and static manner, as if the emancipatory moments of 1917 and 1968 wait to be resumed at some time in a future that never comes. And behind both of these lies 1848, which also continues to haunt our world, as taken up by the situationists, left and council or libertarian communists and anarchists. What if all three are correct, that we are indeed haunted by 1848, 1917, and 1968, that these moments actually circumscribe present possibilities? Then the question would be, how so? The point would be, contra both the Spartacists and Postone, to grasp how and why the pertinence of history changes and fluctuates over time and as a function of the present. The point would be to be able to grasp a nonlinear conception of historical progression and regression. If, according to the Spartacists, the moment of the Bolshevik Revolution remains permanently relevant, and for Postone, Marx remains permanently relevant, this side of overcoming capital, then we ought to be able to explain how this is so, and in ways the Spartacists and Postone themselves have been unable to do. This is precisely what Platypus sets out to do. Let me begin again now with 4 quotations to be considered in Constellation. The first is from Walter Benjamin's 1940 Theses on the Philosophy of History. Karl Kraus said that origin is the goal. History is the subject of a structure whose site is not homogeneous empty time, but time filled by the presence of the now. Thus, to Robespierre, ancient Rome was a past charged with the time of the now, which he blasted out of the continuum of history. The French Revolution viewed itself as Rome incarnate. It evoked ancient Rome the way fashion evokes costumes of the past. Fashion has a flair for the topical. No matter where it stirs in the thickets of long ago, it is a tiger's leap into the past. This jump, however, takes place in an arena where the ruling class gives the commands. The same leap, in the open air of history, is the dialectical one, which is how Marx understood the revolution. In attempting to read the history of the accelerated demise and self-liquidation of the left after the 1960s, reading it, as Benjamin put it, against the grain, we in Platypus face a problem discussed by Nietzsche in his 1873 essay on the use and abuse of history for life. Nietzsche said, "A person must have the power, and from time to time use it, to break a past and dissolve it, in order to be able to live. People or ages serving life in this way, by judging and destroying a past, are always dangerous and in danger. It is an attempt to give oneself, as it were, a past after the fact, out of which we may be descended in opposition to the one from which we are actually descended." As Karl Korsch wrote in his 1923 essay on Marxism and philosophy, Marx wrote that humanity sets itself only such problems as it can solve, since looking at the matter more closely, it will always be found that the problem itself arises only when the material conditions for its solution are already present or at least understood to be in the process of emergence. Close quote from Marx. Korsch goes on, "But this dictum is not affected by the fact that a problem which supersedes the present may have been formulated in an anterior epoch." As Adorno wrote in his 1966 book Negative Dialectics, "The liquidation of theory by dogmatization and thought taboos contributed to a bad practice. The interrelation of both moments of theory and practice is not settled once and for all, but fluctuates historically. Those who chide theory for being anachronistic obey the topos of dismissing as obsolete what remains painful because it was thwarted. The fact that history has rolled over certain positions will be respected as a verdict on their truth content only by those who agree with Schiller that world history is the world tribunal. What has been cast aside but not absorbed theoretically will often yield its truth content only later. It festers as a sore on the prevailing health. This will lead back to it in changed situations." We in Platypus consider ourselves, quite self-consciously, to be a function of such a return, under changed circumstances, to what was cast aside but not absorbed theoretically. We think that such an approach as ours is only possible by virtue of the ways history, in failing to be transcended, continues to fester, yielding its truth content but only later. Our approach is informed by prior models for such an endeavor, namely Trotsky and Adorno, and those who succeeded them, namely the Spartacists and Moïse Poston. We think that figures of historical thought and action, such as Marx, Lenin, Luxemburg, Trotsky, Lukács, Korsch, Benjamin, and Adorno, have apparently fluctuating pertinence, but we consider them to remain in constellation with the present, however distantly, precisely because these historical figures remain painful because they were thwarted, and because history rolled over their positions without their having been actually transcended and superseded, but only mistakenly dismissed as obsolete. As Adorno put it in one of his last essays, Late Capitalism or Industrial Society, or Is Marx Obsolete? If Marx had become obsolete, this obsolescence will only be capable of being overcome on the basis of Marx's own thought and model of historical action. We in Platypus think that the same goes for Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky, and Adorno himself. If these historical figures are obsolete, but still remain capable of holding our attention and imagination, then we are tasked with explaining any continued pertinence they have by reference to their own models of historical thought and action, and thus, in a sense, transcending them, but only through remembering them, and on the basis that they themselves provide for our understanding them. We want to transform the ways these figures haunt us in the present into a matter of actual gratitude as opposed to guilt. We recognize that Marx and the best Marxists, such as Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky, will be transcended only by being fulfilled. We want to actually make them obsolete, whereas we find their pseudo-obsolescence declared by the left today to be a function of trying to repress or ward them off instead. We begin with the discomfort of their memory as an important symptom of history in the present. But this involves a rather complicated historical approach, one that goes on in Platypus under the rubrics of regression and critical history, or history against the grain of events, which I would like to explicate now. Nietzsche described what he called critical history, or an approach to history that is critical of that history from the standpoint of the needs of the present. Let me cite further from the passage of Nietzsche's Use and Abuse of History for Life I've already quoted to illustrate this point. Nietzsche said that, "Here it is not righteousness which sits in the judgment seat, or even less mercy which announces judgment, but life alone, that dark, driving, insatiable, self-desiring force." So the question becomes how, if at all, does memory of historical Marxism serve the needs of the present? We in Platypus recognize both the obscurity of the heritage of revolutionary Marxism and the ways the alternative, non-revolutionary lineage of the left in its decline, has been naturalized and so is no longer recognized as such. Our point of departure is the hypothesis that the history of the left, however obscure, is the actual history of the present, or more accurately, in Hegelian terms, how the history of the left is the history of the present in its actuality, in its potential for change and transformation, and in its constraint of such potential. We are bound by the history of the left, whether we recognize this or not. For example, we follow Trotsky's caveat about the danger of being Stalinist in method, if not in avowed politics, and judge the left today to be beholden to Stalinism in important unacknowledged ways. Ian wrote an article in the May issue of the Platypus Review on resurrecting the 30s, in which he cited C. Wright Mills on how the nationalization of the left in the 30s and 40s was catastrophic. We recognize this nationalization, the narrowing of horizons for leftist politics that has been taken for granted by the left, especially after World War II, to be the very essence of Stalinism and its historical legacy in the present. More importantly, we recognize that such nationalization of left politics was utterly foreign to the perspectives of Marx and the Second International radical Marxists, Lenin, Luxemburg, and Trotsky. Hence, we find in their example a potential critical vantage point regarding the subsequent historical trajectory of the left. Furthermore, Nietzsche described the danger of the attempt to give oneself, as it were, a past after the fact, out of which we may be descended in opposition to the one from which we are actually descended. It is always a dangerous attempt because it is so difficult to find a borderline to the denial of the past, and because the second nature usually is weaker than the first. Richard, in his comments at our panel, The Decline of the Left in the 20th Century, Friday night, spoke of how Trotsky and Benjamin provide the hidden or esoteric history of the 20th century, by contrast with its real history, exemplified by FDR and Hitler. Our present world is more obviously descended from the history of Hitler and FDR, who in this sense made the world what it is today as the effect of their actions. But how might we come to be descended also from Benjamin and Trotsky? Can we claim their history as ours, or are we condemned to being only the products of the history of Hitler, FDR, and Stalin, and those who followed them? Does the historical possibility represented by Trotsky and Benjamin have any meaning to us today? Clearly, their historical legacy of opposition is weaker than the other dominant and victorious one. But was Trotsky and Benjamin's opposition to Stalin, FDR, and Hitler so fruitless that we cannot make use of them in fighting against the continued effects of, and perhaps one day overcoming entirely, the legacy of these latter figures? It is in this sense that we can discuss the critique of the present available in history. Benjamin contrasted such critical history of the vanquished, which is related to, but the converse of Nietzsche's critique of the present from the standpoint of history, as opposed to Nietzsche's critique of history from the standpoint of the present, to the affirmative history of the victors, the affirmation of history as it has happened. But first, we need to be very clear about what Benjamin meant by the vanquished, who were not merely history's victims, but the defeated, those who actually struggled and lost. Benjamin's example was Rosa Luxemburg's Spartacus League in the German Revolution and Civil War of 1918 to 1919. It was on behalf of such historically vanquished that Benjamin wrote that history needed to be read against the grain of the victories of the status quo that comprised the present. It is in memory of their sacrifices, the anger and hatred that emanates from the image of enslaved ancestors, that Benjamin thought the struggle for emancipation in the present could be motivated by history, that history could serve the present, contrary to the way it otherwise oppresses it in its affirmations of the status quo. It is in this sense that we in Platypus do not claim so much that Marx, Luxemburg, Lenin, and Trotsky, and others, were right, but rather we seek to make them right, retroactively. We do not claim their relevance, but seek to make them relevant. For they did not seek merely to find the crisis of capital, but rather to bring it about. Our critique of the present, initially, is what is available historically, how the present can be critiqued from the vantage point of history. The founder of the Spartacist League, James Robertson, once put it very well in 1973, in the aftermath of the 60s, that the truth is historically conditioned. That is, the outlook of the communist movement of the first 4 congresses of the Communist International rested upon a historic and successful upheaval of the revolutionary proletariat in 1917. A comparable theoretical breakthrough and generalization accompanied this massive revolutionary achievement. It is as though the theoretical outlook of the proletarian vanguard in the period 1919 to 1923 in the International stood atop a mountain. But since then, from the period of the Trotskyist left opposition until his death and afterward, the proletariat has mainly witnessed defeats, and the revolutionary vanguard has either been shrunken or its continuity has been broken. One cannot separate the ability to know the world from the ability to change the world. And our capacity to change the world is on a very small scale compared to the heroic days of the Communist International. Robertson pointed out how deeply mistaken and indeed arrogant it would be for us to assume that we know better than the revolutionaries historically did. Our point is not to idolize the past, however, but rather to instill an appropriate sense of humility towards it. Furthermore, the point is to be able to think in light of the past, how the past might help us think in the present. For not only might we not know their past moments better than they did, but we might not know our present moment better than they might be able to then they might be able to prompt us to think about it. As Adorno wrote in 1963, the theorist who intervenes in practical controversies nowadays discovers on a regular basis, and to his shame, that whatever ideas he might contribute were already expressed long ago, and usually better the first time around. But repetition is regression. The second time around may not be better, but it might yet be productive in certain ways. For it is not a matter of how these historical thinkers and actors we find important can be emulated in the present, practically, so much as it is a question of how far their perspective might see into the present. Not what they would do in the present, but what might they say to our present and its historical trajectory. So initially, it is a matter of theory more than practice. Engaging the historical thought and action of our revolutionary Marxist forebears is not a matter of applying a ready-made theory, but rather tasks our own interpretive abilities. It demands that we think, not a simple matter. As Trotsky wrote to his followers in the 1930s, we must learn to think, again. This is what distinguishes us from other supposedly Marxist organizations. And this is what informs our practice, what we actually make happen in the world, as Ian will discuss. Approaching history this way allows us to pose certain questions. It does not provide answers. The positive content of historical ideas is in their ambiguity. This is what makes them live for us today. By contrast with the dead positivity of the pseudo-ideas, really the suppression of thinking that we find on the fake left today. For there is not merely the question of what we think about the past, but also, and perhaps more importantly, in our regressive moment today, the reciprocal one, what the past might think of us. As Benjamin put it, history needs to be approached from the standpoint of its potential redemption. We think that the historical thought and action of Marxism demands to be redeemed, and that our world, dominated by capital, will continue to suffer so long as this task remains undone. We think that the constitutive horizon of our world was already charted, however preliminarily, by the revolutionary politics of historical Marxism, but that this horizon has become only blurred and forgotten since then. We in Platypus set ourselves the task of initiating thought about this problem from deep within the fog of the present. We look back and see the revolutionary Marxists looking towards us from that faraway mountaintop. In their fleeting gaze, we find an unfulfilled hope and a haunting accusation.
Thank you, Chris. Ian will be our final presenter, and then we'll go into the Q&A.
My presentation is going to be of a sort of different style. It's much shorter, too. I was asked to give a presentation called What is to be Done? I'm sure you've heard this line. And I wanted to say from the beginning that the way that this phrase is used, I think we should be very suspicious of people who ask what should be done after every sort of theoretical or conversation or forum or so forth that we do, by the mere fact that they seem to be implying that what we're doing in our forum or so forth is not a doing at all. So I was going to open up with a quote by J.P. Cannon from his book on the history of American Trotskyism. He's not a great theoretician, but it's a good line. If the group misunderstands the task set for it by the conditions of the day, if it does not know how to answer the most important of all political questions, that is the question of what to do next, then the group, no matter what its merits may otherwise be, can wear itself out in misdirected efforts, futile activities, and come to grief. Our project has often been understood practically. There's sort of two historical fantasies that often come up. One of them draws a parallel with the Partisan Review, and the other one with the Frankfurt School. Our Death of the Left thesis and the historical gulf between the 30s makes this practical orientation completely anachronistic and very confusing. The Partisan Review made a specific intervention in American socialism, and the early Frankfurt School was set up to provide an intellectual atmosphere which would transcend certain sectarian divides after the failure of the German Revolution. There's no such comparable milieu in our time to either intersect or transcend. And the problem is much more thoroughgoing than the simple realization that left third parties are defunct, and that organized labor is also very fractured and weak. Both of these reasons, too, it would be absurd to think of ourselves as some kind of propaganda organization, as most left groups do. We're not propagandizing to anybody. We don't think there's such a milieu to intersect with propaganda. The groups which talk about the left justify their existence on very dubious grounds and do more to muddle issues than they do to clarify them. And this is certainly obvious, I think. Many of these groups are actually very conservative in nature, and their underlying theses are of a conservative character, and I think they manifest a new right. Because the left really is dead, we must first and foremost build intellectual milieus from scratch. As we've often said, we must host a conversation that would otherwise not happen, and we must demonstrate to other people that the Platypus conversation can happen at all. But we have an extremely strong track record with our events. We provide a space in which intellectuals are able to sound much stronger than they would otherwise have the opportunity to. Our main point of intersection, for better or for worse, is universities and the campus culture more broadly conceived. There is simply no other institution we could realistically intersect today. And that's not a blessing. But it does raise a great deal of opportunity. Universities are very much an international phenomenon. They're very cosmopolitan in nature. People go from one university to the other, no milieus from all around the world, really. And it's also probably the only time in their lives that they'll have a serious time to study the history of the left, and that's a serious opportunity. I think we need, one thing is to modulate our public events more. We need more styles of public events, more topics, more ways to deal sometimes with the same issue with a different crowd, to change our language and so forth. And I think in changing our sort of organizational culture, we have to do much, much more work about following up on our events. We have to build the milieus afterwards. In the past, we've done a lot of work towards the events. We've created reading lists and so forth, but we haven't done enough to keep that conversation going. I strongly believe that regularity of events is sort of the life or death of our group, and it won't be to the detriment of the content to have more events, as it's sometimes thought. On the contrary, I think that we'll learn to improve the quality of our events only through regularity, only through different milieus coming and different types of arguments being posed, even if perhaps we're saying the same thing. We have a sort of another thesis about our organizational work. It's called draining in the swamp. And I think many people find their ways into left groups purely by the fact that there's nothing else there. And it's very much a revolving door for people, and so it's sort of a swamp one gets stuck in when they're, in the university culture, and we want very much to end that revolving door factory. We want to tell people that the conversation that these groups are having is actually interesting. The Platypus Review is another thing that we've started, and we don't take full advantage of our paper right now. I really think we need to marshal a great deal more effort in our group to do this. We have extremely high quality paper, but it fails on 2 scores. The first is obvious that we lack outside content, and everyone in the group needs to find more people outside of our group to reflect on questions that we think are pertinent. They're questions that many people on campuses already have, but don't have a way to give them a richer context. I think things like interviews are extremely important, more reporting on the sorts of left events that happen at different universities. And I really think the goal, and this is what we're lacking, is to be some kind of historical record on the left. It's not about creating a platypus position or finding our theoretical roots, but it's making some kind of way to understand the present, and we won't be able to do that from our own writings. The other big question for our group is membership, and the only way I can say what we want is that our reading group is in no way optional. The texts we read are not roadmaps, and in one sense the line that we do have is that. It would perhaps be, there's perhaps nothing that we believe more than the inadequacy of making a roadmap out of such texts of the past. It's not possible to understand the reading group, or to understand our group outside of the reading group and our events, and having the many long conversations one should have when they've read such things. Hold on 1 second. One concern that we should have is working with people who think that our project is self-evident, and that I think we should be very suspicious of any such person who feels that way about the history of the left. If there's one thing that's especially surprising about our project, it's the way in which once people have gotten the ideas under their skin, that they've never left. So what are our members to become? I think intellectuals and cultural workers of some kind. There's no notion today of a free intellectual, much like liberalism, because liberalism is dead. There's much more at work than simply good ideas in the making of public persons. We cannot let the topics which we're trying so hard to unearth to become taboo to us in all of our public dealings. There really are people who are having a concerted effort to squash the project on that level. The sectarian left would love us to disappear. They're set on their ways, and they would prefer it if their own ideas that they have would never come to the light of day. The need to go to left events is probably the most important thing for all of our members. I think there's really a sort of house of cards model with these events. You could ask just a very simple question and change the conversation entirely. There's something amazing about how the simple questions are asked. But also, I think we should have no illusions that our project is extremely time sensitive. We live at some kind of crossroads here at the death of the left. And though it may seem that we have an overabundance of esoteric ideas forcibly put together, that is the estimation of our time.
Hello? Okay.
Wow.
It's working. So we'll take questions and answers for the next hour or so, I suppose. They can be directed to the panelist at large or an individual panelist. And just start with Lori.
So Ian just spoke about membership, and I kind of wanted to expand on that, but mostly to Chris and Richard, who have given very different, less concrete. Now that Ian has raised the question of membership, how is the membership to understand what you guys, the two of you, have just presented?
I think that they're rather separate issues. I mean, there are a lot of different models we could have for membership or organizational models. I don't think that that's particularly necessarily connected to our ideological project. I mean, we don't really know clearly what Platypus is. We don't think of Platypus as a political party, but as some kind of an organization. We have a newspaper, which is in some ways an organ for our organization, but it's not intended to be a party newspaper. And in fact, the biggest problem we've had is that we want more external context representing non-platypus views against which platypus can rebound. So I think the membership question is a separate practical instrumental question, and I don't have clear views on what should be done on that. I'm also, and this I'm probably in the minority in the organization. It's unclear to me that. No, I just want to say one thing, but it's unclear to me that membership, while it's a practical necessity for Platypus, is sort of central to the project, because to the extent we're interested in creating a milieu, we don't necessarily need a large membership. Members are really the people who do the work, but really, while that's obviously a very important practical necessity, what we really want is a broad milieu of people who will listen to or think about these ideas. Not even necessarily even agree with us, but pay attention to the ideas. So.
I mean, there's some, I was looking back at certain historical contexts, if there's some kind of precedent organizationally. There's an interesting example that at one point the group around Shachtman wanted very much to orient towards youth to sap out Stalinism from America. That failed, and we're almost in a similar situation. Like, we want to sap out bad pedagogy about the left, and we could only do that starting in university culture.
Yeah, I'd like to elaborate on that a little bit, that phrase, bad pedagogy. In other words, we don't consider the sectarian left to be truly political. In other words, we don't consider groups like the Spartacists or the ISO or the RCP to be really political organizations. Rather, we consider them to be bad pedagogues. I
mean, I don't mean to interrupt you, but the idea that they're political is bad pedagogy. I think that's
right.
Sort of the point.
Yeah. So there are two elements to the pedagogy. One that's more direct, meaning the kind of vulgarization of ideas. The other, though, is more indirect, which we would also like to participate in, although our politics in this respect would be liberal, meaning that we're trying to offer not just to our members or even through membership in the organization, but really what we're trying to do through things like the paper and the fora, like our events, the kind of conversation we're trying to host, is give a pedagogy not of ideas, but also of political practice. In other words, we're kind of thrown back onto an Enlightenment model of philosophical debate, meaning, we're back to the realm of, teaching people that ideas matter and that, in a sense, the polity can be constituted at the level of ideas. And so in that sense, the bad pedagogy is both ways, meaning there's a purveying of bad ideology, but there's also the purveying of a bad model of politics.
I mean, sometimes I think we might get a bad rap, which is difficult about, we have a sort of attack on activist culture. And one thing about theory and the sort of what is to be done question is that we very much want to hit the brakes. We want to stop people before they act to think. And that is damaging to activism on one level. If you think of activism as not, intimately bound with theory, if you take activism as a sort of ideology of that people only learn to understand the world, it's somehow born of struggle in a way that is not linked to reflecting on that struggle, or that you can only struggle and then reflect or so forth. This kind of idea is very problematic.
I wanted to make, I just wanted to make two practical points. One is that the fact that the Platypus Review exists is to some extent an accident, because the original goal of Platypus, before it really became a group, was to set up some kind of academic journal. So we never, paradoxically, we weren't able to do that, but we were able to produce sort of a newspaper or of a certain kind of academic tone. And the other is that the fact that Platypus focuses on certain things or does certain things is not necessarily an indication of our goal. I mean, there are a lot more things that if we had a broader membership that we could do. And a lot of people who have interest in certain areas that if we were a bigger organization, we would focus on doing. I mean, there are people in Platypus who do things like labor organizing and so forth. So we're obviously not opposed to that. I mean, it's not that we're opposed to any type of concrete political activity, and there were people, it's a very mixed and complex question. A lot of people in Platypus were involved actively in SBS.
Yeah, I want to say something. I want to maybe put a finer point on Ian's point about activism. I think that what's being referred to there is protest culture, which is different. In other words, what Christian Parenti, Doug Henwood, and Lisa Featherstone called activistism, or what Adorno called actionism. Because from the 60s to the present, a lot of political activism is actually A, not political, and B, not really an action, not really, actual action. In other words, going to a protest, going to a demonstration is not organizing workers. Like, those are two completely different actions, and the fact that we can think of both of them as actions is itself a problem. So it's not that we're trying to interrupt action, it's that we're trying to interrupt activistism, which is a different kind of thing, and we're trying to interrupt the protest culture. I think that part of the origins of Platypus comes from both among the younger and older generation in the group. The feeling that, we would go to demonstrations, we'd go to protests, we'd go to anti-war protests, and we'd feel like we were suspending disbelief while attending the demonstration. In other words, we wanted to be there, we wanted to, have our feet on the ground, register our protest, our heart was in the right place, but we felt like we had to suspend our own thinking in order to participate, because the slogans, because the kind of conventionality of the event, what people seem to tacitly agree upon, was something that, in a sense, we had to suspend disbelief about because we found it inadequate. And what we found was that there was this strange phenomenon that probably most people at these demonstrations feel the same way, right? In which case, that begs the question. In that respect, it shouldn't be seen as theory as opposed to practice. Rather, we have our own theory-practice problem. And we relate that to the typical bad left's botching of the theory-practice problem, right? In other words, they have their way of dealing with the theory-practice problem, and we have our way of dealing with the theory-practice problem. And they're not antithetically opposed. What they are is related, right? In other words, we're trying to make up for a deficit. We don't expect activistism to go away, but we do want to interrupt it. We do want to add something, that's a missing element at this point.
I mean, actually, our paper is very much inspired by the problem of protest culture. I'm sure everyone has had the experience who went to a protest of getting just a plethora of crazy newspapers that you couldn't make any sense of, really, with all different variations on worker or something. And that's a very odd sort of experience that young people have no way of even decoding this kind of strange language that's been passed down, and that was at least my experience during the Iraq War, going to protests and taking all these different sorts of views, but I couldn't make heads or tails of any of them, really. And I think that's most people's experience. And that what's sad about that is that I think people are actually very interested in those ideas, but have no real access to where such positions come from, what the motivation is, because it is a kind of like position taking that's very incoherent in our time. And so that's one of the reasons why we, emphasize more when we read the classical texts of Marxism, what is the general impetus behind these writers, and not these sort of classic disputes that are, the Lenin-Luxemburg dispute or so forth, that are sometimes very obscuring of what it is that they actually agree about. So in a way, anyone who is interested in making a decoder for this world is a writer for our paper. It's about reflecting on that kind of experience that is very common for people in their university life if they go to protests.
Right, there are maybe two things about that are important. One is that the sectarian left is there, and there is this kind of museumified Marxism that gets trotted out, as well as there's academic leftism, meaning you read Foucault and you're supposed to understand what Foucault is in dialogue with, and it's just this sort of tacit kind of understanding of, okay, there's some kind of critique of Marxism going on here, but it's all underspecified. And what we're trying to do is essentially reconstitute the debate that's taken for granted and that doesn't occur, meaning you go to a protest, you get several different groups, sectarian newspapers, you make sense of them yourself, and really, these groups don't speak to each other. The reason that they don't speak to each other is that they don't really speak to begin with. Right? So the point is that, we're trying to, in a sense, make the dead speak by putting them in dialogue with one another. And, our own contribution to that is simply why we think that needs to happen. In other words, all of these groups basically pretend the other groups don't exist and wish the other groups would go away. But in so doing, they've abdicated on politics. In other words, they've abdicated on the actual controversies in favor of some kind of brute, kind of sectarian, schisms. And I think that, again, our model is something like the conversation on the left that supposedly is always going on, but somehow never takes place. We're actually trying to make that happen.
If we can, if you guys don't mind, I'd like to take some more questions. We have quite a few backing up in the audience. It's Gabe, and then I think Troy, the guy in the red shirt, Ashley.
Oh.
Yeah, we've got quite a few. So maybe we'll try and keep the responses a little shorter so that we can get to more questions.
Gosh.
I don't really, well, I guess it's sort of, I could formulate my response as a question. So, like in response to what Ian was saying, like squashing the kind of bad pedagogy at universities. Like,
Draining the swamp.
What?
Draining the swamp.
Draining the swamp, right. Well, like, I don't know, I would say like, that's almost like ceding too much ground, maybe? Like, aren't we challenging them to be better, to like articulate, to like challenging them to speak to one another? It's kind of the point that you kind of arrived at. But I would say that like, maybe we're ceding too much ground to this idea that we're like just squashing them. The point is we're challenging them to be better activists, to just articulate their thoughts so that it's kind of, one can make head or tail of their like, political context that they kind of exist in. And then also, what happened to the Journal of Letters that was supposed to rival?
I want to say something about the journal because it was raised. Yeah. The journal project is still in the offing, meaning that it's not that the Platypus Review has replaced the journal project. And also the journal project is not really meant to be an academic journal. It's meant to replace the New Left Review and destroy that milieu. And, in other words, what? Well, yeah, all of the whole apparatus. And related publications. There are other kind of versions of this, historical materialism, etc. And, especially in the Anglophone world, but we really aim to sort of, to, in a sense, again, provide a different context. And it wouldn't be, either an academic journal, nor would it be like Platypus, right? But rather, a place where existing kind of left intellectuals could be prompted to write, think in ways that they're not now prompted to do. And that project continues. It just takes a while to start such a journal, and it also involves establishing relationships with people, which we're also doing through our public fora and whatnot. In other words, inviting people to speak on panels, to engage these debates, to sort of fertilize their thinking in such events, is a way of demonstrating that an audience for the kind of journal we want to start could exist. Because right now, the existing sort of intellectual left essentially assumes that such an audience can't exist, and that's why you get the antics of a Zizek. Right, because there's essentially a notion that there's no audience for this anyway.
Well, let me clarify something, actually, because the draining the swamp idea is different than smashing the dead left or something like this, yes, with a hammer. It's more the idea that there are people trapped in this swamp or whatever who, I don't know, are going to be fossilized very soon, or, as they're falling down, like waving to each other or something. We want to drain that sort of morass so that people could talk to each other. So when we have our public events, we always invite, usually, someone from, a sectarian left group, if that's the term to be used, a student who does some kind of activism, one of us, maybe a left academic. That's usually the formula every time. And our experience has been that the context we create, those people are much, much better than they're able to be in their books and like in the New Left Review or so forth, by the very context and conversation we're making and they very much feel is impossible. So that's the idea. I think it's not about smashing other groups or anything like that at all. It's about people who give each other the silent treatment or something like this. And would, in what is to be done, of course, there's this thing about freedom of criticism. I mean, this is ripped out of context, really, but, the way that people use the idea of freedom of criticism actually to stifle criticism, this kind of psychology, because that book is all about opening up a conversation that Lenin didn't think would happen in the Second International, basically. And we want to make a conversation that people, even though they carry on, don't think is possible at all.
I wanted to respond to 2 points. One was the point about people and not talking and like pretending nobody else exists. The thing that actually first attracted me to the Spartacist League was not their manifest politics, some of which actually repelled me initially, but rather the fact that there were all these esoteric polemics against bizarre little other groups. And I found that very attractive because it meant that they were the only group on the left paying attention to other groups on the left. And that was very interesting to me. And the other thing that attracted me to them was that you could get their bound back issues. So I now actually own, though they're now in storage, like all their bound issues from the 60s through the early 90s. And reading them was a great education in the history of the sectarian left. And it gives you, despite whatever problems one might have with the specific criticisms or positions, there wasn't anything comparable where one could get such information. I mean, it was very hard to get that type of information. The other point I wanted to go to was this metaphor of draining the swamp. And here I'm going to be a bit of a devil's advocate. The first thing that came up to mind with that image was there's a place in the Galilee, northern Israel or Palestine if you prefer, where there are the Hula swamps. And it was one of the early heroic stories of Zionist pioneers that they drained these swamps, and they were very successful in draining the swamps. But it ended up causing huge ecological disaster. So what is the point of this metaphor? Because they did drain the swamps and build agriculture, but it turned out the swamps were very important for the ecology of the region and so forth. And they hadn't realized that when they did that. So the point of this is that we actually have a parasitic relationship to both the sectarian left and the academic left. And while I am constantly filled, I put that image of the rapture, etc. in there, which obviously is not going to happen. But while I am constantly filled with annoyance at the sectarian left, the prospect of it literally disappearing is actually frightening to me. And I think it is questionable whether we in Platypus could actually carry on in a world where certain symptoms of the dead left completely disappear. I mean, that may seem like a contradictory message, but it's something we have to think about. And I think that there is a way in which the content of academic leftism has itself deteriorated as external sectarian leftism has started to dry up. And that's not a problem that in the long run we would be immune to.
But let me add one thing, because it's also, I guess, the idea of the revolving door, sort of a different image, but that my feeling usually is that a lot of people who get involved in the sorts of groups that we're talking about. It's very much a 2-3 year project for them, and the experience is extremely one of disillusionment. I was talking to somebody at a party not that long ago about their experience in one of these front groups, and they were extremely fascinated by Marxism and had read everything that they could get their hands on, but they were kind of shocked by the way that they thought, because they hadn't been addressed up front with the theories, all the theory of Marxism when they got involved in this group, that they really had the sense that even though the group was Marxist in some sense, they didn't believe that they could appeal to people with their own ideas. And that was a very depressing way to come to Marxism and left. And so they'll wander off and do this or that activist thing until it peters out, when there's no war going on or so forth.
Okay, we'll take the next question. I think it's Troy, and then the guy in the red shirt in the back row there. Troy's the, I'm sorry, in the front row.
Hey there. So I wanted to, I guess, I don't know exactly how to divide it. I guess there's two parts. I think the first one is, as Platypus is a talking shop, but, more than that also, or hoping to be more than that or whatever. And it's not in a negative sense, a talking shop. I just wanted to bring up 2 points which might improve the talking that goes on in the talking shop. One is that I think that, a focus on destroying the New Left review and critiquing all these left groups, as somebody said at the beginning section on Friday, has to be situated within a broader, should be situated within a broader aim of fixing the problems of capitalism, or, transforming capitalism into socialism or something like that, and learning from the history of the left and stuff like that in order to fix the problems. I think that should be made more clear, or be more the case. Second, I think a better understanding of U.S. imperialism should be fostered within this talking shop. Like it was said in the presentation that American imperialism is no longer fighting leftists or whatever, it's now fighting reactionary Islam.
Well, predominantly.
Okay, predominantly, but certainly not solely. I mean, if you look, many places in the world, it's not fighting reactionary Islam. It's fighting many different types of groups, and even in the Arabic world, it's not fighting solely reactionary Islam. It's fighting Baathists who are secular. It's fighting communists. It's fighting the oil workers union. It's fighting a lot of people. Just turned off, I think. But anyway, and then the second thing, other than, I also wanted to say, in addition to the talking shop, what do I think we need to change the world? And I think we need to build a revolutionary organization that's going to put into practice all of this theory. And what type? A type like the Spartacists who focus like who you mentioned, Rubin, are crazy and just focus on attacking other left groups or stuff like that. I don't think that's the type. I think we need a type that's going to the people that are open to propaganda and getting involved in stuff. Ian, you were saying there's nobody open to being able to propagandize too. That's simply not true. I talk to people all the time who are really interested. Like you said, there's all kinds of people who are very new to these ideas, very interested in moving forward, and not at all interested in focusing on the New Left Review and how they suck and how all these different left groups suck. No, they want to progress. And seeing, like, for example, seeing Obamaism, I agree that it's not all, like, great. But seeing everybody, and labeling everybody who's, like, for Obama and stuff as, like, reactionary or whatever, no, there's some progress. There's some open people there, and those need to be gotten. And an attitude of sectioning yourself off comes out in positions like, going to a protest. I agree with you. Going to a protest is not all that political to do, but it is not organizing workers inherently, because workers go to protests. You can go to a protest and critique it. You can go to a protest and organize. And just one more clarification. I'm in the ISO, for anybody who doesn't know already, International Socialist Organization. I don't know how many people are not in Platypus here or whatever, or haven't been here at the conference, but so it's wrong to say that the ISO, as if it were one single person, doesn't, or nobody on the left talks to anybody else except for this part. I'm here. I've been talking to a guy in FRSO who goes to Cornell with me. So it's. I just wanted to point that out, that we shouldn't judge other groups based on pieces of our experience. Our experience, which is only a piece of that other group. You know what I'm saying?
Yeah, we can get the rejoinders from the panelists.
Yeah, you might want to take others. So.
We'll take one question at a time. We'll try and just maybe keep each panelist to one response.
I'll respond briefly. I mean, vis-a-vis the ISO and the Spartacist League, I mean, the Spartacist League publishes all sorts of attacks on polemics against the ISO, which I would probably be largely in agreement with. But I've never read any polemics by the ISO against the Spartacist League in the paper. I mean, there's an asymmetry in the way that the two organizations conceive of their role as revolutionary Marxist parties. And I think that the Spartacist League is clearly the exception, and the ISO in that respect is the norm on the left. Now, whether that doesn't necessarily make the Spartacist League a model, but it certainly makes it more interesting to me than the norm. But we obviously have a different sensibility. With regard to American imperialism, really the question isn't understanding American imperialism, because that's not the issue. The question is, what does it say about the world? That the greatest challenge to American imperialism is not coming from leftist insurgents. It's coming from Islamist reactionaries. That says something about historical regression, not about the world. I don't know, I mean...
Of course.
It is. But saying that doesn't address the fundamental issue, which is which is the absence of the left in that constellation. I mean, take, for example, you mentioned the Arab world, and that involves many different cases. But look at Palestine today, which is a case I know fairly well. I mean, if you look at Palestinian politics in the 70s, you would have seen a lot of leftist, nationalist groups, many claiming to be Marxist. Now, whatever one's critique of them, clearly those groups have disappeared. The dominant political force in actually opposing Israel, it's Islamists, it's Hamas. I mean, there's no way of getting around that, and that's true throughout the Middle East. It's true throughout the world. The cases where, even the cases where there are leftist political movements, like in Latin America, they're tame versions even compared to what existed in the 80s or the 70s. I mean, not that the 70s and 80s were really better. I'm not trying to foster that. But it's obvious that there's been a massive transformation in the world, and it's a transformation to the right. And it's the non-acknowledgement of that fact is what's significant, not, quote, the understanding of American imperialism, because American imperialism hasn't changed. It's not American imperialism which has changed. It's the left. It's the collapse of opposition to it from a leftist direction. I mean, there are people who are opposing American imperialism for all sorts of reasons, but they're reactionary reasons. And if you want to talk about that, if you want to talk about American imperialism fostering reaction, I mean, one of the things few people on the left will say is that if the Soviet Union had won in Afghanistan, 9/11 would never have happened. Not only will people on the left not say that, people on the right won't say it. It's one of and it's clear. It's clear that one of the ultimate causes of 9/11 was the policy followed by the United States government that directly funneled money to the Islamist reactionaries who were fighting the Red Army. So that's a context in which the left doesn't acknowledge its own history. I mean, overwhelmingly, the American left, including the supposed far left, were supporting the Mujahideen. Well, there were other groups.
Yeah, there were a couple
There were
of
other
groups.
groups. Communist Party, Workers' World Party. It's a little more complex than that. There were some liberals, too, like Fred Halliday. Because I think the model of building the left in the way that you're talking about it already entails a concession to a bad history. That's the real difference.
Can we take one more question?
Well, I
or
was
would you
going
guys
to
like
say one thing,
Sure,
and
go ahead,
I'm not sure if it's totally helpful, but I was recently at an event that a representative from the trade unions in Iraq was at, and they were talking about a conference that they had in Erbil there were almost no left groups there for reasons one could explore. But something that I found somewhat shocking is that their conference, which was an attempt to unite the various unions in that country, which do nonviolent work, which are anti-religious, which are anti-sectarian, which have women's rights groups and so forth, all sorts of interesting demands. Their conference would not have happened without a group called U.S. Labor Against the War. Even though the labor movement is extremely small in America, the left in other countries is dependent on it. And so, I mean, Lenin used the term tailism, supporting this or that group in another part of the world. I mean, we should be more conscious by the fact that an absence of a left in America is extremely detrimental to left groups abroad, and that's a burden we have. And I think the typical anti-imperialist rhetoric really confuses this burden that we have. And so it's a question of theory, it's a question of a certain kind of conversation that would have to start for anyone to even begin to think of the sort of complicated practical issues that would be involved and we might not have answers to.
I want to say something about propagandism. The Spartacist League, what do they call themselves? A fighting propaganda group. I'm not sure what the history of that term is. I think that it might have a deeper history. So like the self-understanding of a group like the ISO might be something like that, but you're doing propaganda. It's not like a political party. It's rather a propaganda group. You're trying to get ideas out there, intersecting people in their political activities at the level of ideas. That's where we get back to the bad pedagogy. Meaning that, and getting back to Gabe's question about draining the swamp, the revolving doorism that Ian brought up, my experience now that I'm, faculty and not student, and I spent a number of years like tuning out the left, although Richard kept me informed. The experience was, because we're old friends from college, that not only do you get a bad education in the sense of what Marxism is about from groups like the ISO and the Spartacist League and others, RCP we can point to. Also, I think that's like an activistism idea, like the idea that you brawl with the police, that's how you make the people revolutionary. But that it's depoliticizing in another way. In other words, you not only get a bad education in what Marxism is about, but you also get a bad education in what politics is about. So that people, spend a few years as young people when they're idealistic in these organizations, and then they quit. And they quit and become politically cynical. They quit and become people who hold their nose and vote for the Democrats. That's what happens in 99% of cases. It's only the true nut jobs who stay in these groups. Okay? In other words, it self-selects for bad human material. And so then what do you do? Like, in other words, like, what do you do? What happens to people when their initial experience of Marxism is one of crude ideas and futile activity? Right? In other words, the reason that we say that we're not trying to do propaganda is precisely because the model of propaganda refers to a historical period in which people were more active politically, in which society was more politicized, in which the working class was more organized, in which the left was more self-consciously and principally politically organized. Ian talked about going to a protest and getting all sorts of newspapers. Well, that's one thing. In the 1930s, people would have been literally yelling at each other. In other words, you would have gone to Greenwich Village, you would have gone to Washington Square Park, and people would have been literally haranguing each other. But respectfully, like not maybe sometimes beating each other, but not always. But there was, a sense of, politics through ideas in a way that's really lacking now. So it's not that propaganda is like a bad model, but it is sort of misplaced right now in comparison to what it used to be. So our attitude towards groups on the sectarian left is that they're doing what they have always done out of the context in which that ever made sense. In other words, doing it in the 60s also wasn't doing it in the 30s. Doing it in the 30s didn't work, first of all. That was the original context, but didn't work. Carrying on in the 60s as if you just continue to do it also didn't work. And continuing it today is just a surreal, like we call it, a zombie practice. no matter what, it appears to be. So, why we don't do propaganda? Because the propaganda is bad, and because that model of activity is without a context. So I would say, in terms of draining the swamp and stopping the revolving door, that we would like to prevent people in college from having their first experience of Marxist ideas be the sectarian left or the bad faith ex-new left academic leftists. We do desire that to be put a stop to, absolutely. Now, of course, what Richard's saying is true too, meaning you can't bring that to an absolute halt, but you can transform it, right? In other words, Richard's saying, okay, if they all disappeared in the rapture, it would be terrible, there'd be no context. We're for nudging things along and clearing out the cobwebs and waking up the zombies, whatever metaphor you want to use. And I think that Ian said earlier about the House of Cards character, meaning that one of the reasons why groups don't like to deal with us is because they detect the fact that if they engage in this conversation, their whole thing might fall apart. And it will. It will fall apart. We want that.
Take the next question. I'm going to take Ashley's, even though it's a little out of order, just because she has to leave. Hold on, wait for the microphone. If you will. Thank you.
So I want to thank you guys for your panel. Chris, you kind of talked about, not in these terms, but this is what I wrote down, about relearning and redefining our relationship to the past. And I think that kind of requires a certain amount of unlearning, particularly, I can say, from personal experience. And I think that this is kind of at the core of my incapacity to answer Richard's question last night about my relationship to history and things like this, because it's requiring so much unlearning on my part to be able to engage in that sort of conversation. So maybe from a very practical level, maybe this is something Ian can address, how do you see Platypus facilitating this starting over process for folks, or when you're starting from scratch? Because to be quite honest, and I think that this isn't an adequate critique of you guys, you seem esoteric to a lot of people because they haven't had experience with you or with Marxist ideas, or B, they've probably maybe been affiliated with folks that they need to be doing a lot of unlearning. So how do you see this being facilitated? Because although I think that the reading group is a good way to do that, if you're coming into it late, that's a hard conversation to start having. So yeah, for the crowd of people that are maybe like myself that maybe are a little bit politically immature, but kind of craving this sort of conversation.
I just want to kick it off just very quickly, and then I'll turn it over to you guys. I think that, Ian was talking about the importance of the reading group for people who are participants as members in the organization. But the reading group is not like the, in a sense, the be-all, end-all of the group by any means. Really, the best sort of initial exposure that we can provide for people doesn't come through reading groups or even something like this talk that we're giving today, or even the talk that we gave Friday night. What we're really trying to do at the level of relearning, rethinking, changing the relationship to the past, that's what we're trying to do through the fora and the newspaper. And that's where the majority of voices will not be from this organization. In other words, on a forum panel, it will be 4 people and maybe 1 person from Platypus. And the person from Platypus is there just to piss people off so that they have to shake themselves out of their complacency. Because I've served that role and that's what I've been doing. So the initial exposure is not to our ideas, but to the conversation, right? And which is also meant to be productive for us, right? In other words, it's not like I think that this came up, when did it come up on Friday night maybe? We don't have a theory. We're about remembering theory. We don't have a theory, right? It's not like that kind of pedagogy. It's more the pedagogy of the conversation, making that happen. And that's really, in a sense, how we hope people will refine a relation to the past. Not through what we have to say, but what we try to get other people to say.
My response is twofold. One, on the question of us being esoteric. The problem is not that we seem esoteric. but that we're actually more esoteric than we even seem. That's the real problem. The problem of us seeming esoteric is actually, I think, more a problem of people's anxieties to the parts that are not that esoteric. So I think that a lot of people avoid us, not to the extent that they don't understand us, but to the extent that they do. But the real problem is that we are much more esoteric than we seem. And that's the problem at the deepest level.
There's a flip side to that.
Yes, there is a flip side, definitely. With regard to the question of unlearning, which is a problem I've thought about a lot, because as I said, I did not come to Platypus as some 18-year-old or 19-year-old who's in a class with Chris Cutrone. On the contrary, coming to Platypus, essentially alongside Chris, was a process of massive unlearning, and is still a process of unlearning, and something that I have deep resistance to. There are many aspects of Platypus that I inwardly resist, and I'm constantly challenging myself. And I've gone through several stages in my political thinking, all of which involve considerable unlearning, so that before I went to college, I had sort of a new-lefty, Chomskyite type perspective, unspecified, which had kind of grown sort of organically out of a kind of default liberalism in my family. Then I encountered the Spartacist League, adopted, not literally, but essentially a Spartacist perspective, which then in turn was, to a certain extent, unlearned to adopt a Platypus perspective. And I'm not sure at the end what that exactly has left me with, but I'm saying that because it's important to understand that that's at the core of the project, particularly among the people who started the project. To the extent that some people may be able to start with Platypus and sort of see the left through Platypus lenses, I have much greater difficulty understanding those people than I do the people who resist Platypus. I mean, I'm glad that they exist, but I have difficulty understanding how anybody could see the world starting out, or the left, rather, through Platypus. It's kind of astonishing to me.
We'll take the guy in the red collared shirt in the back there, and then we'll take the gentleman at the center.
Yeah, I was wondering if you could speak to how important you think it is for your project and for having a sort of viable Marxist understanding of the present in general to look at consciousness within the working class and different trends and tendencies among workers. And if you think that's important, how would you propose sort of reading that or learning about that? Is it because obviously groups on the left might not represent that the best? So what milieus could people use?
Well, answer that question maybe in a couple different ways. Well, one thing I guess I would point to a certain 60s view of the world about the idea of students as a class. As one thing is that I think we maybe unconsciously keep. I think people who go to school for higher education is a much, much broader group of people than it was in the past. But also we've done events with labor organizers. Maybe that's a little bit different than what you mean by the working class when you said that question. But we're very interested, obviously, in exploring those types of politics in the way universities intersect them, for one thing. So it came up last night with, that students serve as the cannon fodder for a lot of these labor groups, do a lot of organizing with them without thinking, and that those milieus are, the university and its like wider culture intersects a much, much wider array of society than I think people think. But also, so there really is something confusing about politics when people raise this abstract working class having to be met. And it's a part of the 30s propaganda model of politics that I think I would raise. So I mean, that's connected. I think our real disagreement is the connection with not wanting to be a propaganda organization, because I think we want to foster a certain kind of conversation, and obviously anybody can come to our reading groups. Anyone can come to our public events. They're open to the public. We publicize them in all sorts of different kinds of places. They're not exclusive to any type of group or person or so forth. So I guess I would just question a certain typical stereotypes that are out there about this abstract working class that's often referred to.
At the same time, I would modulate that a little bit. I think that, first of all, because we do these events, we do have established relationships with people, quite far afield, both from ourselves as well as from the sectarian left, as well as further afield from the academic left. And those relationships are vital, meaning, the labor organizers that we deal with and those milieus that we intersect both inform, our own thinking about things, as well as provide different kinds of audiences. Like the newspaper is not only distributed on campuses, but also at union halls, where we have existing relationships with people. And, it's a little bit of a shot in the dark to expose unionists and regular working class people to the kind of esoteric conversation going on the left. But frankly, it's only a variation of the kind of discourse that you find in places like The Nation, which of course, militant working class people read those kinds of publications. And it's not utterly extrinsic to that nor foreign to it. I think it does matter to us, but I think that we've accepted the fact that we can only have, in a sense, a more indirect relationship.
I think, just to piggyback a little bit, like if we could have a stronger pedagogical relationship to a larger section of society, we would. But I think right now we're interested practically in what the fetters are on such a practice, and I don't think the propaganda model of hanging outside the factory with your paper is especially effective one. Unions in the past, but the Port Huron statement, for example, Port Huron is a sort of retreat for the UAW. They sponsored that conference. And unions are much smaller, so they use their budgets differently. And another thing too, I think people get a bit confused about the left because it's so small today that one group is meant to be the jack of all trades for this new left that we don't have. There really is a division of labor. We're not going to preach the tactics of union politics. That would be ridiculous of us. It would be wrong. But if there was a real medium where one could make ideas more broadly accepted, that we would be interested in that.
Okay, well, I guess we'll take the next question, which is the gentleman here. And the suspenders.
I haven't been thoroughly convinced that the left is totally dead, but I think the argument is pretty well established that if it isn't dead, it's pretty close to it. I've been around for a while, and whatever the reason the left has become what it is, it's a fact. And the other side of that is that bourgeois ideology is not only pervasive, but it's corrosive. And that I think is part of the reason why you see some of the left moving right. Mm-hmm. And so my question is, I've been very pleasantly surprised by what I've found here since Friday, so I'm very glad to see this. But how do you account on an objective basis and somewhat concisely how you've resisted this extremely corrosive bourgeois ideology?
Let me say one thing just before you, Richard, just very short. Our whole slogan, the left is dead, long live the left, is not our propaganda. maybe that should be said. It's a provocation. When we go to protest and we have that slogan, it's not like a declaration.
So to make people think. Yeah.
That's the idea. It's supposed to almost be Dada-esque, sort of like, what is that? What do they mean? I don't get it. It's not supposed to be like, oh yes, the left is dead.
Right.
That's not, I mean, that's important. I just want to point that out.
Okay, I'll just respond to 2 points. One is I think it's not just the idea that bourgeois ideology is so pervasive, because bourgeois ideology has always been pervasive. The problem is that the bourgeois ideology is so crass, and that in a sense that bourgeois ideology is corrosive to itself, that there's a corrosion on both sides, that and as you said, and that also affects the left, or what remains of it. As for the question of resisting bourgeois ideology, I wouldn't put it that way. Chris and I actually come from quite radically different class backgrounds. Chris comes from a working class background. I come from a bourgeois class background. And I don't think that necessarily had much impact on obviously our very different personal backgrounds had much impact on our political development. The curious thing, and it's something that I have in common with Chris, and I've never been quite able to explain it, is that the most radicalizing moment for me politically was what is generally seen as a huge defeat and catastrophe for the left, namely the collapse of Stalinism in 1989 to 92. And it's
collapsed to the right.
It's collapsed in the sense of capitalist restoration in Eastern Europe and the disintegration of the Soviet Union. And the reason that it was radicalizing in an intellectual sense was that it actually confirmed for me the validity of Trotsky's basic analysis, which previously I had been strongly resistant to and doubted. So the irony is that a profoundly negative event within that analysis pushed me to a sense of its truth value, which was a paradoxical relationship to sort of be pushed to the left intellectually by an event that was pushing the whole world fundamentally to the right. And it was partly that dual consciousness that I think made it impossible for me to quite literally accept Spartacism. And I remember talking to a very much older comrade who had been part of the original Trotskyist movement, who had been part of the Communist League of America, and a founding member of the Socialist Workers' Party, and was part of that 30s generation, organic, working class intellectual, all of that, and remained faithful to those ideas till his death in the mid-90s, a few years ago, I should add. And he was very puzzled by this because his experience of radicalization was in the context of a massive working class movement. He came from a communist family background, and it was the upsurges of the 30s. And it is a paradoxical situation, and one that I think has left a not necessarily desirable intellectual mark on me. But I remember thinking at the time, why is it that so